On the morning of January 24, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton stood in the conning tower of the USS Wahoo, staring at something no American submarine commander had ever seen up close: the entrance to Wewak Harbor, New Guinea Japanese-controlled territory, uncharted waters. And Morton was about to sail right into it. He wasn't navigating with sophisticated charts or military intelligence. In his hands was a high school atlas, the kind Australian kids used to study for geography class. One of his crewmen had picked it up almost as a joke while they were docked in Brisbane. Now it was the only map they had. What happened over the next 72 hours wouldn't just make military history. It would shatter Japanese confidence, revolutionize American submarine warfare, and create a legend that would echo through the Pacific Fleet for the rest of the war. When Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor on February 7th, she had expended every single torpedo in just 23 days, a third of the normal patrol time. The submarine was flying a battle flag that read, "Shoot the sons of bitches." Japanese naval intelligence was frantically trying to understand what had just hit them. One submarine. 3 days. The rules of naval warfare had just been rewritten by a man nicknamed Mush and his executive officer Dick O'Kane, who would go on to become the most successful submarine commander in U.S. Navy history. But before we understand how one submarine accomplished what entire wolf packs struggled to do, we need to go back to the beginning, to understand why American submarines were failing in the Pacific and why it took a commander with a very specific kind of aggression to change everything. In late 1942, the American submarine force was in crisis. Not because they lacked submarines. The Gato-class boats rolling out of shipyards were among the most advanced undersea vessels in the world. Not because they lacked courage. Submarine volunteers knew they were signing up for one of the most dangerous assignments in the Navy. They were failing because of doctrine, because of caution, and because the weapons they were counting on to win the war didn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be America's secret weapon. It ran on steam, carried a massive 600-pound warhead, and featured a magnetic exploder that would detonate beneath enemy ships, breaking their keels. In theory, it was devastating. In practice, it was a nightmare. The torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than their depth settings. The magnetic exploders detonated prematurely, or didn't detonate at all. Contact exploders failed. Torpedoes porpoised to the surface, revealing the submarine's position. Some made circular runs, threatening to sink the submarine that fired them. And the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance refused to believe the reports from submarine commanders. They insisted the torpedoes were fine. It was the skippers who were the problem. But there was another problem, even more fundamental than faulty weapons. American submarine doctrine in the early war was defensive, conservative. Skippers were trained to approach cautiously, fire from maximum range, and immediately retreat to avoid counterattack. The periscope was to be exposed for no more than a few seconds, just long enough to verify the target and fire. This wasn't how you win wars. This was how you survived them. Across the Pacific, Japanese merchant convoys were delivering troops, supplies, and fuel to garrisons from Truk to Rabaul to the Solomon Islands. Japanese destroyers and cruisers operated with impunity, and American submarines, the ones that were supposed to strangle Japan's supply lines, were returning from 60 to 75-day patrols with 1, maybe 2 confirmed kills. Meanwhile, German U-boats in the Atlantic were sinking Allied ships by the hundreds. They hunted in wolf packs, attacked on the surface at night, and pressed their attacks with ruthless efficiency. American submarines had better boats, better range, better habitability. But they were being badly outperformed by an enemy that understood one simple truth: submarines are offensive weapons. Then came the USS Wahoo and Dudley Walker Morton, Mush. Morton, his nickname short for Mushmouth, earned at the Naval Academy for his tendency to tell tall tales, was not supposed to be commanding a submarine at all. Earlier in 1942, he'd been relieved of command of the USS Dolphin because the boat's machinery was in terrible condition. Relief from command usually ended a submarine career. But Morton got lucky. In December 1942, Morton embarked on Wahoo's second war patrol as a prospective commanding officer, essentially an observer learning the ropes under Lieutenant Commander Marvin "Pinky" Kennedy. And what Morton observed horrified him. Kennedy was cautious to a fault. He missed opportunities. He refused to close with targets. He fired from extreme range and retreated at the first sign of danger. Wahoo's first 2 war patrols had been frustrating exercises in missed chances and defective torpedoes. The crew was demoralized. The executive officer, a young lieutenant named Richard O'Kane, was becoming increasingly frustrated with Kennedy's timid approach, but someone at Sub-Pac headquarters saw potential. When Wahoo returned to port in late December, Kennedy was reassigned, and Dudley Morton, the commander who'd been relieved just months earlier, was given command. Morton made changes immediately. In every other submarine, the captain manned the periscope during attacks while the executive officer managed the plotting and calculations. Morton flipped it. Dick O'Kane would man the periscope. Morton would run the attack from the conning tower, calling out orders based on O'Kane's observations. This freed O'Kane to stay on the periscope as long as necessary, to track targets, observe their responses, and make split-second adjustments. Morton could think strategically instead of being limited to brief glimpses through the scope. But the real change was philosophical. Morton gathered his crew before their 3rd patrol and told them something no submarine commander had said before. Wahoo is expendable. We will take every calculated risk to destroy the enemy. If anyone doesn't want to go along, now is the time to transfer. Not a single man left. On January 16, 1943, USS Wahoo departed Brisbane, Australia, bound for Japanese-controlled waters off northern New Guinea. Her orders: reconnoiter Wewak Harbor and attack targets of opportunity. Wewak Harbor had never been charted by the U.S. Navy. There were no detailed maps, no intelligence reports, no reconnaissance photographs. Morton didn't even know what he'd find there, just that it was an active Japanese base, and he was going to sail right into it. The decision to use that Australian school atlas wasn't bravado. It was necessity. The atlas showed the basic coastline and the harbor entrance. That was enough. Morton believed that surprise and aggression would overcome any disadvantage from poor intelligence. He was right. As Wahoo approached Wewak in the pre-dawn darkness of January 24th, Morton surfaced to get a better view. What he saw made every man on the bridge catch his breath. Nested alongside a pier were several Japanese Roe-class submarines, the very boats that had been harassing Allied shipping throughout the Pacific. And sitting with them, tied up and stationary, was the destroyer Harusame, a destroyer, in port, defenseless. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. Morton submerged and crept into the harbor. Wahoo's crew could hear the echo-ranging pings of Japanese sonar, but the enemy wasn't expecting an intruder. Why would they? No Allied submarine had ever been bold enough, or crazy enough, to penetrate a defended harbor. Wahoo moved into firing position. Range 1 and 200 yards. Morton fired 3 bow torpedoes at Harusame. All 3 missed, or they malfunctioned. It was impossible to know which. But the torpedo wakes gave away Wahoo's position, and suddenly the entire harbor erupted. Harusame began getting underway. Alarms blared. Japanese sailors poured onto the decks of every ship in the harbor, lookouts scanning the water for the intruder. Morton fired a 4th torpedo. Harusame turned hard and evaded it. Now the destroyer was coming straight at Wahoo, full speed, intent on ramming or dropping depth charges, and Morton had 1 torpedo left in his bow tubes. This is where most submarine commanders would have retreated. Run deep, escape under the enemy's sonar, live to fight another day. Morton did the opposite. He ordered Wahoo to hold position and wait. Through the periscope, O'Kane watched Harusame charging toward them, her bow cutting through the water like a blade. The range closed. 1,000 yards, 800 yards, 600 yards. "Captain, she's going to ram us," someone said. "Hold," Morton replied. 100 yards. Morton was waiting for the last possible moment. If he fired too early, Harusame could evade. If he waited too long, the destroyer would be on top of them before the torpedo armed itself. 100 yards. Fire, Morton barked. The torpedo leaped from Wahoo's bow tube and streaked toward the oncoming destroyer. O'Kane kept the periscope up, watching. The torpedo wake sliced through the water. Harusame's captain saw it. He turned hard to port, trying to comb the torpedo's track, and that's what doomed him. If he'd maintained course, the torpedo probably would have missed. But the turn brought Harusami's midship directly into the torpedo's path. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive column of water erupted amidships. Harusami staggered, her keel broken, and began listing immediately. Morton didn't wait to watch her sink. "Take her deep. All ahead full." Wahoo dove and ran for the harbor mouth, depth charges exploding in her wake. But the Japanese defenses were in chaos. By the time they organized a proper counterattack, Wahoo was gone, slipping back into open water. It was the first time an American submarine had successfully penetrated an enemy harbor, and it was the first time anyone had executed a down-the-throat torpedo shot, firing directly at an attacking warship instead of fleeing. Morton radioed the attack to Subpac headquarters. The response was immediate: continue patrol. Engage targets of opportunity. What happened next would become even more legendary and far more controversial. 2 days later, on January 26th, Wahoo was operating between New Guinea and Palau when lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. 2 Japanese freighters traveling without escort. Morton maneuvered Wahoo into position and fired 2 torpedoes at the lead ship, the Fukwei Maru No. 2. Both hit. The freighter began sinking immediately, but there was a second, smaller freighter trailing behind. Morton fired 2 more torpedoes. One hit and the smaller ship began taking on water, but she didn't stop. Her captain turned directly toward Wahoo's last known position, apparently trying to ram. That's when O'Kane spotted something else through the periscope. "Skipper, we've got a large transport approaching. Looks like 5,000 tons, and there's a tanker behind her." Morton didn't hesitate. "Set up an attack on the transport." The transport was the Buyo Maru, and she was carrying over 1,100 personnel, Japanese troops and unknown to anyone at the time. Nearly 500 Indian prisoners of war being transported to New Guinea as forced laborers. Wahoo fired 3 torpedoes. 2 struck home. Buyo Maru shuddered to a halt, dead in the water. But the damaged, smaller freighter was still limping toward Wahoo's position. Morton fired 2 more torpedoes down the throat, straight at the oncoming ship. One hit, but incredibly, the freighter kept coming. Morton ordered Wahoo deep to evade. When they returned to periscope depth, Fukwei Maru had disappeared beneath the waves. The smaller freighter had joined up with the tanker and was limping away. And Buyo Maru was still afloat, listing but refusing to sink. Morton fired another torpedo to finish her. It passed directly underneath the transport and failed to explode. Another Mark 14 malfunction. Cursing, Morton fired 1 more. This one hit and Buyo Maru began her final plunge. After surfacing to recharge batteries, Wahoo returned to the scene. What they found stunned everyone on the bridge. The water was filled with survivors, hundreds of them, and approximately 20 lifeboats organized and disciplined, filled with men in life jackets. Morton knew immediately these weren't civilian merchant sailors. The organization, the discipline, these were soldiers. And under the rules of unrestricted submarine warfare that the U.S. had adopted after Pearl Harbor, soldiers in lifeboats capable of reaching shore were fair. Game. What happened next has been debated by historians. For over 80 years, official accounts say the Japanese troops opened fire on Wahoo first with small arms, rifles, and pistols, forcing Morton to respond. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, explicitly stated that such resistance was common by 1943. Japanese forces rarely surrendered and often attacked their would-be rescuers. Morton's own report admits ordering fire on the lifeboats, but not on individuals in the water. His goal was to force the troops to abandon the boats, leaving them unable to reach shore. Dick O'Kane's account states that Morton gave the order to fire on a lifeboat to make the Japanese abandon them, and that the Japanese returned fire with handguns. Some Wahoo crewmen later told a different story, that Wahoo opened fire first, and that the scene became a massacre. One account mentions a man trying to wave a white flag. Another describes a survivor attempting to climb aboard Wahoo being gunned down. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, obscured by the fog of war and the hatred that existed between American and Japanese forces by 1943. What nobody knew at the time, and what wasn't revealed for over 50 years, was that many of the men in the water were Indian soldiers, captured by the Japanese in Southeast Asia and being transported as slave labor. Of the 1,126 people aboard Buyo Maru, 491 were Indian POWs. In the sinking and its aftermath, 195 Indians and 87 Japanese died. Most of the Japanese were eventually rescued by their own ships. More than half the Indians survived as well, which suggests the firing was more restrained than some accounts claim. But the incident would haunt Morton's legacy. The flag Wahoo flew upon returning to Pearl, "Shoot the sons of bitches," summed up the attitude of the time. Legally, it was murky. The Hague Convention of 1907 prohibited deliberately killing survivors of shipwrecks, but armed troops and boats were always considered fair game on land, why not at sea? And the Japanese themselves routinely machine-gunned American survivors in the water. More importantly, the entire U.S. submarine campaign was technically a violation of international law. The London Naval Treaty required submarines to follow prize rules, warning merchant ships before attacking and allowing crews to abandon in safety. But 4 hours after Pearl Harbor, Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark had ordered unrestricted submarine warfare without consulting the rest of the U.S. government. The view was simple. The Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor forfeited their right to protection under international law. General Douglas MacArthur had no such moral qualms about the Bayo-Maru incident. He awarded Morton an Army Distinguished Service Cross for eliminating so many Japanese troops. Wahoo received a Presidential Unit Citation for her 3rd patrol, and Morton received a Navy Cross. But some have speculated that the incident is why Morton was never awarded the Medal of Honor. Even after his death, Wahoo's 3rd patrol still wasn't over. After dealing with Bayo-Maru, Morton pursued the tanker and the damaged freighter that had escaped. He caught them and sank both with torpedoes, the freighter requiring 4 hits across 3 separate attacks before finally going under. By this point, Wahoo was nearly out of torpedoes. But Morton wasn't done. When they spotted another Japanese convoy, Morton devised a plan that bordered on insanity. He would surface behind a lagging tanker at night, cause panic with Wahoo's deck gun and force the convoy to scatter. Then he'd sink the tanker and pick off stragglers. It almost worked. Until a Japanese destroyer came charging out of a rain squall, forcing Wahoo to crash dive and run for it. When Wahoo arrived at Pearl Harbor on February 7, 1943, she had been at sea for just 23 days. Normal submarine patrols lasted 60 to 75 days. Morton had expended every single torpedo. The submarine had sunk 8 Japanese ships, more than most submarines sank in an entire war. The patrol report was so extraordinary that it was circulated throughout the submarine force. More than the kills, though, Morton had proved something. Aggressive tactics worked. Close-range attacks worked. Pressing the initiative worked. Within weeks, other submarine commanders began adopting Morton's methods. The U.S. submarine force transformed almost overnight from a cautious defensive force into an offensive juggernaut, and the Japanese had no answer for it. Over the next 8 months, Dudley Morton and the USS Wahoo became a legend throughout the Pacific Fleet. On her 4th patrol, Morton took Wahoo into the Yellow Sea near the mouth of the Yalu River, waters where no American submarine had ever operated. Japanese merchant shipping in the area was completely unprepared. Wahoo tore through convoys like a wolf through sheep, sinking freighters and cargo ships almost at will. The Japanese press reported the losses with growing alarm. Who was this submarine? How was it operating so deep in Japanese-controlled waters? On her 5th patrol, Wahoo hunted in the Kuril Islands. Despite continuing torpedo problems, she damaged the seaplane tender Kamikawa Maru and sank multiple merchant vessels. By mid-1943, Wahoo was the most successful submarine in the U.S. Navy. Morton had become the face of the new aggressive submarine doctrine, and his executive officer, Dick O'Kane, was learning everything he could. But success came with risks. On Wahoo's 6th patrol in August 1943, Morton attempted something unprecedented, penetrating into the Sea of Japan itself. The Sea of Japan was Japan's backyard, surrounded on 3 sides by Japanese-controlled territory, with only narrow, heavily mined straits providing access. It was considered far too dangerous for submarine operations. Morton didn't care. He believed surprise would be total. Japanese merchant ships wouldn't be expecting threats in their own protected waters. He was right about the surprise. But the Mark 14 torpedoes finally defeated him. In the first 4 days of the patrol, Wahoo sighted 12 targets and attacked 9 of them. Not a single ship sank. 10 torpedoes definitely broached, ran erratically, or were duds. Others missed and may also have been defective. It was a complete bust. Morton was forced to terminate the patrol early and return to Pearl Harbor seething with frustration, but he wasn't giving up on the Sea of Japan. By September 1943, the Navy had finally acknowledged the Mark 14's problems and was rushing a replacement into service, the Mark 18 electric torpedo. Unlike the steam-powered Mark 14, the electric torpedo left no visible wake. It ran cooler, more reliable, and more accurately. Morton lobbied Subpac headquarters for permission to return to the Sea of Japan with the new torpedoes. Against their better judgment, they agreed. On September 13, 1943, USS Wahoo departed Midway Island for her 7th war patrol. The plan called for complete radio silence. Wahoo would enter the Sea of Japan via La Perouse Strait on September 20th, hunt for 10 days, and exit the same way on October 11th. After clearing the Kuril Islands on the way home, Morton would break radio silence to report his kills. Dick O'Kane wasn't aboard for this patrol. He'd been promoted and was preparing to take command of his own boat, the USS Tang. But he'd learned everything Morton could teach him about aggressive submarine warfare. For the first week of October, Japanese shipping in the Sea of Japan was hammered by an unseen predator. Ships exploded without warning. Convoys scattered. Escorts hunted frantically but found nothing. On October 5th, Wahoo torpedoed the passenger cargo ship Konran Maru off the west coast of Honshu. The ship sank with 544 people aboard, including 2 members of the Japanese House of Representatives. The Japanese press announced the sinking. It was a national humiliation, an American submarine operating with impunity in the Sea of Japan itself, sinking ships carrying Japanese officials. The Japanese Navy launched a massive operation to hunt down and destroy the intruder. They flooded La Perouse Strait with patrol aircraft, positioned destroyers at choke points, and laid additional mines. They knew any American submarine would have to exit through one of the narrow straits. They just had to wait. On the morning of October 11, 1943, exactly as planned, USS Wahoo approached La Perouse Strait, transiting east toward open water and home. She was on the surface in daylight, which was unusual. Morton may have been concerned about mines and wanted better visibility. Or Wahoo may have already been damaged and forced to surface. At approximately 0900 hours, Japanese shore batteries on Sakhalin Island spotted a surfaced submarine. They opened fire. Wahoo crashed dove immediately, but she may have struck a mine during the dive, because she reversed course, heading back west into the Sea of Japan instead of continuing east toward safety. That decision sealed her fate. Japanese patrol aircraft spotted a trailing oil slick. They followed it like bloodhounds, radioing Wahoo's position to every available unit. Between 0945 and 1330 hours, Wahoo was attacked by 10 sorties of 5 aircraft each. Destroyers and patrol boats converged on her position, dropping depth charges in a coordinated pattern designed to bracket her no matter which way she turned. At least 40 aerial bombs and 69 depth charges were dropped on Wahoo over the course of nearly 4 hours. At 1330 hours, the oil slick went dead in the water. The attacks continued until 1630 hours, just to be certain. There were no survivors from Wahoo's 79-man crew. Dudley Walker Mush Morton, the commander who revolutionized American submarine warfare, who sank more ships faster than anyone before him, who proved that aggression and initiative could overcome technological disadvantages, never came home. When Wahoo failed to report after clearing the Kuril Islands, she was officially listed as overdue and presumed lost on November 9, 1943. The wreck of Wahoo wasn't discovered until 2006, when a Russian survey team located her in La Perouse Strait, sitting upright in 213 feet of water, almost entirely intact, with a massive bomb crater near the conning tower. But Morton's legacy didn't die with him. The tactics he pioneered, aggressive approach, close-range attacks, down-the-throat shots, sustained pressure, became standard doctrine throughout the U.S. submarine force. Commanders who'd been cautious became bold. Crews who'd been frustrated became lethal. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk 392 Japanese ships totaling over 5.5 million tons, more than 30% of all Japanese merchant shipping. They sank 1 out of every 3 Japanese warships lost during the war. They strangled Japan's supply lines, isolated garrisons, and crippled the Japanese war economy. The submarines didn't win the war alone, but without them, the war would have lasted years, longer, and cost hundreds of thousands more lives, and the man who learned the most from Mush Morton was Dick O'Kane. In October 1943, the same month Wahoo was lost, Kane took command of the USS Tang, a brand new Gato-class submarine. He immediately implemented everything Morton had taught him. Over the next year, Tang would sink 33 Japanese ships totaling 116,454 tons across 5 war patrols. It's still the most successful record of any American submarine in history. O'Kane's tactics were pure Morton, aggressive, relentless, and creative. On Tang's second patrol, he penetrated Truk Lagoon, the heavily defended Gibraltar of the Pacific, and sank ships in the harbor before escaping under pursuit. On the third patrol, Tang sank 10 ships in a single war patrol, a record that still stands. On the fourth patrol, operating in the East China Sea, Tang sank an astounding 13 ships. O'Kane was awarded his first Navy Cross for that patrol, but it was Tang's 5th patrol, in October 1944, that would cement O'Kane's place in naval history, though not in the way anyone expected. On the night of October 23-24th, 1944, Tang was operating in the Formosa Strait, between China and Taiwan. O'Kane had just completed the most successful 2-day period of any submarine commander in the war. 7 Japanese ships sunk in 48 hours, but Tang was out of torpedoes. She had exactly 2 left in her forward tubes, her last chance to add to an already legendary patrol. Just after midnight on October 24th, lookouts spotted a large Japanese convoy silhouetted against the moon. It was heavily escorted with multiple destroyers circling like sharks. O'Kane decided to attack on the surface, the most dangerous approach possible, but also the most effective. Tang crept into the convoy formation, maneuvering between the merchant ships and their escorts. At point-blank range, less than 1,000 yards, O'Kane fired his last 2 torpedoes. The first torpedo ran straight and true, striking a transport amidships. The ship erupted in flames. The second torpedo didn't. Seconds after launch, lookouts on Tang's bridge saw something that turned their blood to ice. The torpedo had broached, jumped to the surface, and was making a circular run. It was heading back toward Tang. All back emergency. O'Kane screamed, "Right full rudder!" Tang's engines screamed in reverse, her screws churning the water to foam. The submarine began turning hard to starboard, trying desperately to avoid her own weapon. But it wasn't enough. The torpedo struck Tang's stern at 02:30 hours on October 24th, 1944. The explosion was catastrophic. Tang's stern was blown off. She began sinking immediately, going down by the stern in 180 feet of water. In the chaos, 78 crewmen went down with the submarine. Only 9 men managed to get off the sinking boat, O'Kane among them. They clung to debris in the darkness, watching Japanese destroyers hunt for them, listening to depth charges explode over Tang's wreck as the Japanese tried to make sure the submarine was dead. 4 hours later, a Japanese patrol boat picked them up. Dick O'Kane spent the next 10 months as a prisoner of war, enduring interrogation, starvation, and brutal treatment in Japanese POW camps. He was held at Ofuna, a secret interrogation center where prisoners were beaten, starved, and denied Red Cross protections. He was liberated in August 1945, weighing just 88 pounds. For Tang's last 2 patrols, in which he'd sunk 24 enemy ships, Richard O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor. He also received 3 Navy Crosses, 3 Silver Stars, and the Legion of Merit with Combat V. When he retired from the Navy in 1957, Rear Admiral Richard O'Kane was the most successful submarine commander in American history. He still is, and 9 Tang crewmen survived the war. 78 did not. The fate of Wahoo and Tang might seem like cautionary tales, legendary submarines brought down by bad luck and faulty weapons. But their real legacy isn't in how they were lost. It's in what they accomplished while they lived. Together, Wahoo and Tang sank over 50 Japanese ships. They pioneered tactics that would be used by every submarine commander for the rest of the war. They proved that American submarines could dominate the Pacific if their commanders had the courage to press the attack. Morton and O'Kane showed an entire generation of submariners what was possible. They proved that technology alone doesn't win wars. Aggression, initiative, and leadership do. Did you know that of the 263 American submarines that conducted war patrols during World War II, 52 were lost, a casualty rate of nearly 20%. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. military. But those submarines sank 30% of all Japanese merchant shipping and nearly 200 Japanese warships. They turned the tide of the Pacific War as surely as any battle fleet or carrier group. The men of Oahu never knew that their third patrol, those incredible 72 hours in January 1943, would change the course of submarine warfare. They were just following their captain into hell and trusting he'd bring them back. Most of them he did, until the mission that he couldn't. There's a reason Japanese admirals were stunned by what one American submarine accomplished in 72 hours. It wasn't just the number of ships sunk, though 8 vessels in 3 days was unprecedented. It wasn't just the audacity of penetrating a defended harbor, though that had never been done before. It was what those 72 hours revealed, that the rules of submarine warfare had changed. That caution was no longer the path to survival. That the hunter who pressed the attack would always defeat the prey who tried to hide. When Oahu sailed into Wewak Harbor with nothing but a school atlas and fired a torpedo down the throat of an attacking destroyer, she announced to the world that American submarines were done playing defense. And when she returned to Pearl Harbor flying that flag, "Shoot the sons of bitches," she was telling the Japanese Navy something terrifying. "We're coming for you, and we're not stopping." Dudley Morton never lived to see the end of the war he helped win, but his legacy survived in every submarine commander who learned from his example. In Dick O'Kane, who took Morton's lessons and became the greatest submarine ace in history. In the dozens of commanders who adopted his tactics and turned the American submarine force into a weapon of strategic devastation. When Japanese supply lines collapsed in 1944 and 1945, when their merchant fleet was decimated, when their isolated garrisons starved for lack of supplies, that was Mush Morton's victory. He just wasn't alive to see it. In the end, Oahu's third patrol in January 1943 did more than sink ships. It changed minds. It proved that American submarines, when unleashed with aggressive commanders and clear purpose, could dominate the Pacific. Japanese admirals were stunned because they'd been taught that submarines were defensive weapons, tools for reconnaissance and opportunity strikes. They never imagined a single submarine would sail into their harbor, sink ships in their own protected waters, and escape before anyone could respond. But that's exactly what happened. One submarine, 72 hours, 8 ships sunk, and the birth of a doctrine that would help win the Pacific War. When Oahu went down fighting in October 1943, she took 79 of the bravest submariners in U.S. Navy history with her. When Tang was sunk by her own torpedo a year later, she proved that even the best equipment and the best commanders couldn't eliminate the terrible randomness of war. But what they started, what Mush Morton and Dick O'Kane proved in those desperate months of 1943 and 1944, was that America's submarines could win the undersea war if they fought it on their terms aggressively, relentlessly, without mercy. The Japanese never recovered from that revelation, and by the time they understood what was happening, it was far too late.